Hello everyone. This presentation is about dietary reference intakes, or DRIs. Let's jump in. We will start with our objectives. So the first objective for today is I want you, after the end of this slideshow, to be able to define the specific nutrient recommendation categories. And these are RDA, AI, EER, AMDR, and UL. We'll talk about what each of those means within the DRIs, the dietary reference intakes, and explain how and when each is used. And then also I'd like you to be able to explain how the daily value is used. And then our second objective is to identify if a person is within the correct acceptable macronutrient distribution range, AMDR, for carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. And we'll look at a specific example so that you'll be able to do this. So let's jump in. What are DRIs? Well, DRIs are a set of nutrient intake values for healthy people in the United States and Canada. And these values are used for planning and assessing diets. And the purpose is to prevent deficiency diseases and reduce chronic diseases. So you notice I said healthy people. So these are for people who don't already have a deficiency. So it's for the general population. And so when we're looking at DRIs, the whole purpose of DRIs is to be able to tell us, are we getting enough of a particular nutrient? Are we getting too much of another nutrient? So it gives us these guidelines for understanding how to incorporate nutrients into our diet. Nutrition experts use the results of thousands of research studies to set these standards. So these standards are based on lots of research. That define amounts of energy, nutrients, and other dietary components and physical activity that best support health. And so when I say best support health, I'm talking about best supporting health for specific age and gender groups. So these DRIs will differ, some of them, for different age groups and whether you're male or female. So for example, a 4-year-old would have a very different nutrient requirement than an 18-year-old. These DRIs are set by the Food and Nutrition Board of the National Academy of Sciences, and again, it's based on lots and lots of research. Let's talk about the DRIs. Let's start with recommended dietary allowance. So what is the RDA, recommended dietary allowance? A lot of people will say recommended daily allowance, which isn't too far off, but that D stands for dietary. So recommended dietary allowance, RDA. So this is the nutrient intake amount sufficient to meet the needs of pretty much all healthy people, so 98% of people of a certain age and gender. So we wish this number could be 100%, but we can't ever meet the needs of 100% of our population. There are going to be outliers who need certain things in their diet. So this covers 98% of people, so almost the whole population. And these are used to evaluate your intake of a specific nutrient per day. So the further you stray above or below it, the greater the chance of nutrition problems. So here you can see the RDA, the recommended dietary allowance for iron. We've got life stage here, we've got age, and then we've got the milligrams per day, the RDA for males and females. So here you can see they're pretty much the same until we get to adolescents and adults. And you can see that females end up needing a lot more, especially once we get to this 19 to 50 years range. Females need a lot more iron than males for this life stage. And then when we get to 51 years or older, you can see it's similar. So again, this is because females of this age menstruate, so they lose iron, and they need more in their diet. So here you can see the RDAs are broken down by age and whether you're male or female. Okay, AI, adequate intake. AI is very similar to RDA. It's used in the same way. AI is the recommended amount for a nutrient with insufficient research available to set an RDA. So for nutrients that have an AI instead of an RDA, it just means that we don't have enough research to set an RDA. There's just not as much research. This is still based on science. It's based on estimates of intake that appear sufficient to those healthy for a specific physiological function of that nutrient. So it's used in the same way as an RDA. It's just that we don't have as much data on that particular nutrient, and so we have to set an AI, adequate intake. So a nutrient either has an RDA or an AI, but not both. If there's enough research to really know a whole lot about that nutrient, we set an RDA. If there's not quite enough, this is still based on science, but it's based on the available research that we have, then an AI is set for this nutrient. So let's take a look at chromium. Chromium is essential, we know that. There's just not a whole lot of research that's been done on it, and so it doesn't have an RDA. This molecule is choline. We know that choline is found in breast milk. It's necessary for adults in terms of nerve transmission. Again, not quite enough scientific evidence to set an RDA, so we have an adequate intake, an AI, for this nutrient. UL. Let's talk about UL. This is the tolerable upper intake level. What is this? This is the maximum amount of a nutrient that's unlikely to cause side effects with chronic use, beyond which there's an increased risk of adverse health effects. So again, sometimes we're worried about getting enough of our nutrients. There are some nutrients where if you take too much of them, there's toxicity and there are negative side effects. And so we need this upper level for certain nutrients. And we use this value in order to evaluate particular nutrients if we're taking multiple supplements or using functional foods, so foods fortified with vitamins or minerals and other nutrients. We don't want to go over this UL, this upper intake level. And so when you're just eating food in your diet, people really don't go over the upper level of a nutrient when they're just eating regular food. This happens when we're taking supplements. So for example, if you're taking 3 supplements that all have vitamin B12, and then a protein supplement that has vitamin B12, and then getting it from your diet, you really need to add up your vitamin B12 and see how much you're getting and see if you've reached that upper level or if you've exceeded it. So, and this goes for any nutrient. You've got to add it up for each supplement and make sure you're not going above the upper level. What happens when you go above the upper level, the UL for a particular nutrient? Well, you can get adverse side effects for some nutrients. So, for example, these are pictures showing beta-carotene toxicity. Now, this is not too severe and it can be reversed. Beta-carotene is found in orange vegetables like sweet potatoes, carrots, and orange fruits, not citrus fruits, but orange fruits like cantaloupe, for example. And if you look at this picture here, this baby probably had a lot of sweet potatoes and a lot of carrots. The baby's face is pretty red, and you can see that this baby does have carotenemia. So that is just a little bit of toxicity from beta-carotene. And again, nothing too severe. All you got to do is back off on the orange vegetables. Here, I'm just going to make my pointer a little bit bigger. Here we go. Here you can see the hand of an adult who has taken, who has probably reached and exceeded the UL for beta-carotene by taking supplements. You can see the hand has got that orange color, and here is compared to a hand of somebody who is not taking beta-carotene or not going over the UL for beta-carotene. So again, it just changes the color of your skin, and once you stop, it'll be reversed. Now there are cases where exceeding the UL can have very dangerous effects. So in the 1980s, in the early 1980s, alternative physicians used 2,000 milligrams a day of vitamin B6 to treat PMS, premenstrual syndrome. And what happened was the women who were taking this medication, these supplements, they developed a lot of symptoms that were pretty negative, including the inability to walk. So their symptoms were depression, fatigue, irritability, headaches, and So if we just look at these first 4 symptoms, these are symptoms that are very similar to those that we see with PMS, and so the doctors ignore these symptoms. And then these women develop nerve damage, which resulted in numbness and muscle weakness, and this actually led to some women not being able to walk. Convulsions, skin lesions, and this was not reversible. So these women lost the ability to walk. So the RDA is set at 1 point something for milligrams for vitamin B6. It's really low, and these women were taking way over the UL for vitamin B6. One thing to keep in mind is that supplements are not controlled by the FDA. Food is, medicines are, but supplements are not. And there are still some natural supplements for PMS that are on the market that have very high levels of vitamin B6. And if the FDA had more time, more money, more resources, these would be taken off the market, and many others have been, but there's just not enough time and resources for the FDA to look at everything, to look at all the supplements, all the natural supplements, and take the ones off the market that can be harmful. So it's really your responsibility to look at the supplements that you're taking and make sure you're staying under the UL, the upper limit, for each nutrient. EER. EER stands for Estimated Energy Requirement. This is just the estimate of energy intake needed to match the energy use of the average person within a specific height, weight, gender, age, and physical activity pattern. So this is basically how many calories do we expend, how active are we, and then how many do we eat in our diet. So this is just an estimate. This will be different for everybody depending on their activity level, their age, other factors. And this value is just used to estimate how many kilocalories you need a day. And there is an equation for this. We're not going to go into the equation, but just know that for EER, this is basically an estimate of how many kilocalories we need per day based on our energy level and age, our gender, and some other factors. Okay, AMDR. What is AMDR? AMDR stands for Acceptable Macronutrient Distribution Range. Now, your book doesn't really talk about AMDR in Chapter 2. It goes into it in, I believe, the protein chapter and the chapter on weight management and lipids. It doesn't really talk about it in Chapter 2. So I'm going to tell you what this is because it's pretty important. So the AMDR is the ranges of intakes for the energy nutrients. So remember, those are carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. Those are our energy-yielding nutrients. These are the things that we eat that contain calories, and we break down these energy-yielding nutrients to use energy, to get energy out of them. And so these are the ranges of the intakes for these nutrients that provide adequate energy and nutrients and reduce the risk of chronic diseases. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, for carbohydrates, we should be getting about 45 to 65% of our total kilocalories from carbohydrates. So of all the calories that we eat, 45 to 65% should be carbohydrates. This range is lower for fats. We need less of our calories from fat. Remember, fats yield 9 kilocalories per gram. So we need less of them compared to carbohydrates. So this range is 20 to 35% of our total kilocalories. That should come from fat. And then for protein, it's 10 to 35% of our total kilocalories that we eat in a day should come from protein. So there's a lower level, there's an upper level. For athletes, they need more protein. It could be athletes would want to be on the upper end of this protein range, so they want to get about 35 of their total kilocalories per day from proteins. And so these are going to vary a little bit from person to person. I do want you to know these ranges. We'll use them throughout the semester in each of our units for carbohydrates and fats and proteins, so in each of our energy yielding nutrient units. So please memorize these values because we will be using them throughout. Let's look at a specific example. So I have to make fun of your book a little bit because your book uses some very interesting pictures. Let me get my pointer here. Okay, so here's Phil. I think they call him something else in your book, but your book has some really interesting photos. So here is Phil, meet Phil. He eats a lot of cereal and bread. Every day, he gets about 40 grams of protein, 400 grams of carbohydrates, and 27 grams of fat per day. So we are going to use the AMDR, those numbers that I just showed you on the previous slide, to see if Phil is within the correct AMDR for each of the energy-yielding nutrients, carbohydrates, fats, and protein. So let's look at protein. So I told you that Phil eats 40 grams of protein a day. We know from the last chapter that proteins yield 4 kilocalories per gram. And so we can multiply the number of the grams of protein that Phil eats, 40 by 4, and we get 160 kilocalories from protein. So Phil gets only 160 kilocalories out of all his kilocalories of the day from protein. So if we take 160 and divide that by 2,000, so Phil is eating about 2,000 calories a day. He's getting 160 from protein. We're dividing that value by 2,000 and we get 0.08. We're multiplying that by 100 and we get 8%. So 8% of Phil's kilocalories are from protein. And if we go and look at the AMDR for protein from that last slide, it's 10 to 35%. And Phil is only getting 8%. He falls below this 10%. So he falls below the AMDR. So poor Phil, he needs more protein in his diet. Let's look at carbs. Phil gets 400 grams of carbohydrates a day. That's a lot. We know that carbohydrates yield 4 kilocalories per gram. If we multiply 4 by 400, we get 1,600 kilocalories from carbs is what Phil is getting in his diet. If you divide that by 2,000, so 1,600 divided by 2,000, so this is the proportion of his calories in a day that are from carbohydrates. So 80% of Phil's kilocalories are from carbohydrates. If we look at the AMDR for carbohydrates, I told you in that last slide that it's 45 to 65%. He is at 80%. So Phil really needs to cut back on the carbs. He needs to get a little variety in his diet. He's way too high. His AMDR is way too high for carbohydrates. Let's look at fat. I told you that Phil eats 27 grams of fat. We're going to do the same thing that we did for the other energy-yielding nutrients, except we multiply fat by 9 kilocalories per gram. We know that that's what fat yields per gram, 9 kilocalories. So Phil's getting 243 kilocalories from fat in his diet. We divide this by 2,000. We get 0.1215. We multiply that by 100, and we see that 12.2% of Phil's kilocalories are from fat. So if we look at the AMDR, he should be between 20 and 35%. Between 20 and 35% of his kilocalories should be from fat, and he's only at 12%. So he's too low. Phil needs more fat in his diet, he needs more protein in his diet, and he needs less carbohydrates. So we would be able to, from these numbers, figure out how Phil can increase his fat and protein content in his diet and decrease carbohydrates. So there's an example of how you would use AMDR to figure out if you're in the right range, in the correct AMDR range for carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. Okay, let's do a little summary. Most nutrients have an RDA or an AI. Remember, the RDA was for nutrients that have a whole lot of research, and so we're more confident in this number. AI was still, research is still used to set the AI, but it's just that we don't have as much scientific research. UL, the upper limit, is set for a nutrient if toxicity symptoms have been observed. So we know we don't want to go over the UL. EER was that estimate of total kilocalories that we need to ingest to maintain weight. So it was balancing your kilocalories with your activity level. And then we just talked about how our energy-yielding nutrients, fats, carbohydrates, proteins, have an AMDR, and we want to stay within this range. And you'll be using your 3-day diet analysis reports to look at AMDR for each of the 3 energy-yielding nutrients throughout the semester. Okay, let's just quickly finish up with DV. So these are daily values. So you will see these on food labels. You've probably seen this, percent daily value, DV. And this is a generic standard used on food labels that are more relevant to daily food choices. So when we talk about generic, so this is a generic value. We can't have every single person's specific age and gender group. We can't have the DVs for everybody on a label. That would just take up way too much space and would not be very cost effective. So we have to have a generic standard. And scientists set this generic need. So this is called a daily value, and this is based on a 2,000 calorie diet. Okay, so this is applicable to anyone 4 years old through adulthood of any gender. The daily values for vitamins and most of our minerals are set at the highest RDA value for any life stage group. And this is so that people get enough of their vitamins and minerals. So for example, we talked about how women between the ages of 19, I think it was 55, need more iron. And so we don't have different levels of iron set for different age and gender groups on our nutrition facts label. What we do, what scientists do, is pick the highest level that is needed. So the level that's needed by menstruating women. And that is the daily value that is put on labels. Okay, and then for our energy yielding nutrients, our fats, our carbohydrates, our proteins, and then for cholesterol and sodium. So these are based on a caloric intake of 2,000 kilocalories. So our DVs, our daily values, represent the highest levels for fat. So for example, when we see the DV for fat, that's setting the highest level. So we know that we don't want to go over that. So it really depends on the particular nutrient in terms of how these DVs are set. And the idea is that we're getting enough of our nutrients that we need and not too much of our nutrients like fat and cholesterol, things like that.